Well, it seems there's a general discussion to be had about the UFC entering the jiu-jitsu space, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of noise about that earlier this year, a couple of months ago, when Dana White made his proclamation that they were going to invest $10 to $12 million into jiu-jitsu over the next year. That is a considerable amount of money. And the first question that everybody had was, well, what's that going to look like? And we got a bit of a glimpse as to some of their plans. Of course, they ran the reality show, and they did the big rebrand to UFC BJJ, moving away from Fight Pass. And I think that it caught the attention of the grappling community, right? When Dana White comes in and he throws a big number around like that, people, they sat up and they were suddenly paying attention, right?
Yeah. As soon as anyone mentions millions of dollars, suddenly the BJJ community is very interested.
Well, I could make some money? Wow. Yeah.
It started before that, right? Before everything started, Dana mentioned that they were going to be investing millions, but if I remember, and he wasn't that specific. And then, the ball started rolling, and now he's kind of reiterated it not so long ago. Was that at a UFC press conference or something?
I believe so.
Yeah. I don't know. It's been really interesting. I was just checking now. They've got like 350,000 followers already on Instagram, so it's definitely been well received. But they are leaning heavily on the existing UFC kind of machine, but they were never shy about saying that right from the start. They're basically saying, if you align with us, you're aligning with the biggest combat sports organization on the planet. So it's very attractive for a lot of grapplers. And I actually think they've done really well with the Brazilian community because of Brazil's kind of strong connection to the UFC, and also the Brazilian people that they've got like working with them or associated with them. So they've made a really strong start. Yeah.
It is interesting to to see from our perspective as people who work in the industry, whenever there's like a big new event that comes in, obviously we always kind of follow what's happening. We're always interested to see this of the industry developments. But the UFC making this big statement that they're coming into the grappling space, that's potentially could change the whole landscape. And even people who were maybe only casually associated with jiu-jitsu, all of a sudden they're interested. Because it's interesting, we talked about this before, about how jiu-jitsu is big, but the amount of people who actually follow competition, the amount of people who actually train to compete is a very, very small percentage of the overall grappling community. The majority of people just train jiu-jitsu as a hobby, as a martial art. But even if you are a casual, even if you are just a hobbyist and you just go to the gym a couple of times a week to train with your friends, you probably are very familiar with the UFC. You probably follow the UFC, whether you watch it as a fan or just casually. So even just having the UFC brand a jiu-jitsu promotion is going to bring a lot more eyeballs in, right? And yeah. I think that this is a kind of it's an evolution of their grappling product, because until UFC BJJ was launched, this is not the first thing that they've done in grappling. They had the Fight Pass Invitational running for probably about 3 or 4 years now, maybe longer. But this is definitely this is like a sort of the beginning of a new era, shall we say, for UFC BJJ. Yeah. And what I want to talk about is, well, number one, let's just talk about the fact that this rebrand, they're putting jiu-jitsu first, because the UFC Fight Pass Invitational, it was a cool show and it was a great product. I enjoyed watching it, but it was a little bit vague and unclear, right? Like Fight Pass Invitational, what did that really mean? Yeah. Now they've titled it UFC BJJ. I mean, there's no mistake about what it is that they're doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, the branding is interesting. I'm interested. It's curious in a way that they've just chosen straight BJJ as the kind of the phrase that they're going with, because in general, it seems like nowadays the kind of modern landscape is BJJ is in the gi and grappling is not. It is no gi, basically, and I don't think they got any plans to do gi stuff. I might be wrong, but I don't see it in their plans.
I would be surprised.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like what it's like what you said. This is they've experimented here and there. You know, FPI was decent. They were never really sure about the rules. Being not being around for very long, I don't feel like the matches had much consequence, or you know, they didn't have time to develop stories or anything like that. I don't know if you remember, they also messed around with Quintet. Like they ran Quintet Ultra, and then they did their own thing called Kinectic. I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
Lachlan Giles came along and I think it ruined an entire team on his own and left his 4 teammates sat there doing nothing. But yes, and it's almost like they've experimented here and there, looked at what other shows are doing, and decided that there's enough going on for them to make a proper go of it. And the branding it's a little bit corporate, it's a little bit kind of safe, but I suppose it's paying off for them. They seem to be doing decent numbers.
It's yeah, I mean, it's quite transparent because part of their strategy was to put everything for free on YouTube this year. The BJJ event that they had which was the finale of the reality show. The reality show was free on YouTube, and then the first event, the next event on October 3rd, we're recording this about 10 days before. It's all been free on YouTube, so the numbers look pretty solid. You know, they're obviously, you know, taking advantage of the UFC brand and the existing channels that they have, and they're getting a lot of viewers to come through and to watch that, and whether they are crossover MMA fans or just Jiu-Jitsu guys who have come along to check it out. There's definitely a lot of attention.
Yeah,
let's go back to the...
Oh, sorry,
go ahead.
Continue. No, I was just going to say part of the appeal is definitely the UFC connection, because you know they always choose one or two of the athletes and kind of serenade them a little bit with, you know, ringside seats and loads of attention from socials. So yeah.
So just talking about that rebrand, the first thing that you mentioned I really want to dig into is that kind of the experimentation with the format and the rules. And I find that really interesting because the UFC hasn't changed substantially in decades now. They found their formula quite early. It was in the first, it was by the end of the 90s, they had their product locked in. And then when the Zuffa era started in the early 2000s, you know, it hasn't changed substantially since then. The concept remains the same. The rules haven't changed since then. You know, they got the unified MMA rules. The production has, you know, kind of been streamlined. It's very recognizable product. But the UFC, what they've done with grappling, well, they experimented a lot over the last couple of years, and it seemed like every event was a slightly different format. They had GPs, they had super fights, they had EBI rules, they had different overtime rules, they brought in points, it was submission only, they had long matches, short matches. It showed a willingness to experiment, to dial in the format so that they felt that they had something comfortable. Well, this year they've done that massively so. This is like the biggest overhaul we've seen from them. And just to kind of summarize what those changes are, well, number one, the rules. They've gone to 3 5-minute rounds, which was interesting because for me it always made the most sense. I mean, follow the format of what an MMA fight would be, 3 5-minute rounds. Craig did it at the first CJI. I know Polaris have switched to 3 5-minute rounds for the super fights, and it quite obviously works, especially if it's aligned with the existing sort of MMA style fight as well. It's perfect for the event. But another big rebrand that they did, and probably the most, you know, visually sort of attention grabbing, is, I'm not even sure what they call it, but I'm calling it the octobowl, right? So it's like an octagon inspired twist on the pit. It's obviously a lot closer to the UFC branding and style than just a stage or a mat. The pit has been shown to be a really cool arena for grappling in general, but the UFC have done their little twist on it. What do you think about the octobowl?
Time will tell. That's what I think. In the same way that time will tell whether sloped walls in general are the number one thing for jiu-jitsu. I think in my opinion, the perfect arena is just a really flat but very large ground, matted area. Anyway, yeah, it's I mean, one thing that they've done well is they've realized that having a unique kind of playing area is a good talking point. So that's probably helped them, people talking about it, just like we are now. The 3 5-minute rounds thing, I remember Craig being really upset when they took that from him, but that's kind of one thing where I don't really agree with him. That's a pretty standard MMA 10-point must 3 5-minute rounds. That's normal in combat sports. I'm just surprised it took us so long to realize that in Jiu-Jitsu. But Craig, maybe he kind of popularized it, but he didn't invent it. And the UFC has every right to use that in their Jiu-Jitsu show. Do you know if they've trademarked octobowl yet? Or
the trademark is an interesting one. As far as I'm aware, the actual concept of a pit, the trademark is actually held by, originally Karate Combat, and I've heard that trademark has actually since been transferred and bought by another third party. The UFC seem to have just decided to go ahead and do their version of that.
They have good lawyers, so.
They have extremely good lawyers, and I think that the people who own the trademark have decided that it's just not worth fighting it, because it would take years of getting dragged through courts and astronomical sort of legal fees to try and fight that. And as you said, the UFC have extremely deep pockets, and
especially in Vegas.
Especially in Vegas, and they certainly don't shy away from legal confrontation. So I think that much like the UFC probably turns a blind eye to people all around the world using an octagon-shaped cage, I think that in this case the trademark holders have just decided, well, it's not the worst thing in the world for these guys to be using any kind of pit-style arena, whether it is octagon-shaped or square or rectangular, it just doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. The other big development this year from their rebrand strategy was the reality show. And that made a lot of sense to do something to kick off this new strategy, because it was just like The Ultimate Fighter. It was maybe a streamlined version of that. It was an Ultimate Fighter-esque version of a scripted reality show. But it laid the groundwork for 3 champions to be crowned, right? Mm-hmm. Because, of course, you have the 2 coaches, Mikey and Harrison, who would fight for the 135 title. And then you had 2 divisions with the winner of each becoming crowned 155 champion and 170. And those champions are Carlos Enrique at 155 and Andrew Tackett at 170. I think that was smart, because not only did they bring in sort of a squadron of athletes who could then become regular features on their future events, but I think it was smart to determine champions early, because otherwise sometimes matches, simply super fights, they don't always have the greatest significance, like you said. Like over the last couple of years, you had the FPI, the Fight Pass Invitational events, and those matches, some of them were quite forgettable, some of them were quite memorable for various reasons. But now you've got champions, you've got matches that feed into a potential title shot, and that obviously the title matches, they matter a lot. From your perspective as a promoter, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's very smart, and it's kind of something that we need to do a lot better at Polaris, which is like exactly that. You have the champions, you've got eliminator fights, you've got a clear route for people to aim for the athletes to aim for, and also for fans to kind of follow and understand, like this guy's trying to be the champ at this way, or this girl's trying to be the champ at that way. One of the difficulties with Polaris is only doing 4 shows a year. It's very difficult to build decent narratives around a belt. But whenever we're talking internally, it's always like we need to do something to make the belt story compelling. And then I remember in the early days when we were reaching out to like news articles and things, the first thing they would ask is like, what's the title match, or is there a belt on the line? And we'd be like, because it's just easier for them to talk about as well, instead of just a bunch of super fights one after the other. Yeah, I mean, it was no Ultimate Fighter. Like Ultimate Fighter 1 was one of the most iconic pieces of, combat sports reality TV ever. And part of the reason for that was the characters that were on it and the stuff that they got up to. I mean, MMA fighters especially amateurs or they're just wild men, and in the house was a fucking crazy place. You remember what they were doing? It was bananas.
Yeah, it was totally unhinged. Yeah. I mean, across different shows, they were scrapping, they were running through walls, they were just up to all kinds of shenanigans. But we didn't see any of that on the grappling show because it wasn't filmed like that. It was interesting. I spoke to some of the participants, and they said that they weren't even held in a house. They were put up in a hotel, and they were only brought out of their hotel. They were basically prisoners. They were locked in their hotel room, and they were only brought out when it was time to train, cut weight, film scripted segments, and compete. And the rest of the time they were held almost in isolation, which is a very different vibe. So we didn't get that sort of we didn't get that ancillary stuff that made the Ultimate Fighter series so special, right?
Yeah, and then but I think it also highlights a key difference between MMA people and Jiu-Jitsu people. They're just so different, because you seem to put those MMA guys in a room together and they'll just start talking shit, or they'll start poking each other, or something's going to happen. And Jiu-Jitsu guys, they probably happily just sit there staring at their phones for half an hour until everyone gets bored and leaves.
Yeah, they're all friends. They're all trained together. There's no controversy.
I watched a lot of the reality show, and sometimes I just had to turn it off. I just couldn't handle the interactions, because it's like almost like trying to force something that isn't there. And I mean, I remember watching The Ultimate Fighter and discussing it online, because I used to spend a lot of time in forums and things like that, and a lot of people were kind of proud of themselves for saying, "Oh, I don't want the drama. I just want to skip straight to the match at the end." It's like, no, like that's missing the entire point of the show. It is a reality TV show with some fighting at the end, but the fighting is often not very good because it's a bunch of amateurs trying to get into the big leagues. So the whole reason you're watching the show is to watch the stuff that they get up to in between, and that was missing a little bit.
Yeah, good point. Definitely good point. Yeah, it was definitely very, very scripted. Every segment felt like it had a purpose, and that there was no room at all for really showing off the personality of the guys. But that was a different choice for sure. Definitely a streamlined version of a reality TV show.
Yeah.
You mentioned a good point earlier as well about the sort of the number of events that they've done. And my belief is that they've only planning to do 3 UFC BJJ events this year. They had the season finale and the initial event, UFC BJJ, where they crowned the champions. They've got another one coming up, and I think I've heard that they're going to squeeze another one in before the end of the year. I think there's one around the end of November, somewhere around there. But there's a big question about how many events to expect in 2026, because grappling is not like MMA. MMA fighters they can fight maybe 3 times a year, possibly 4, but that is on the upper end, for these guys. That 2 to 3 times a year is kind of what you expect from active MMA fighters. Whereas grappling competitors, they can literally compete every weekend, and many of them want to be competing at least once a month in high-level events. Yeah. So I feel like the number of events that we could expect from UFC BJJ in 2026, I would be surprised if they didn't do 1 a month. Otherwise, you've got these guys on contract, you've got these guys who are signed to UFC, some of them are exclusive, some of them are not, but it just doesn't make sense for them to be sitting around and only competing 2-3 times a year, right?
No, you don't want to end up with a one championship situation with like Bushesha friggin' sitting around for 2 years, But we'll see, because they've said similar things in the past. I think with the Fight Pass Invitational at one point, because we talked to them quite a lot as we're partnered with UFC Fight Pass. So they said many times how they were going to do loads of events, and it just didn't materialize for whatever reason. But to go from, like you said, 3, potentially 4 this year to, what are they saying, 12 or 14 next year?
I heard 10 to 12, possibly more, yeah.
That's going to be tough. Really, really tough. That's a full-time, dozens of staff operation, and I don't know, a lot of fighters needed. But that's the only way that they're going to be able to kind of replicate the UFC model in Jiu-Jitsu, is doing that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how many people they have exclusive now. I think, as far as I understand it, they want the champions exclusive because it's too high risk to have a champion go and fight in another organization and potentially lose. In fact, that's why Fion's next match with Polaris will be her last, because we had a kind of legacy contract that we'd signed with her, but she's now signed with the UFC, so we've basically come to an agreement that she'll do Polaris and then just be doing UFC BJJ. But right. I'm pretty sure they don't want 30, 40, 50 people exclusive with them. Otherwise, they're going to run into trouble matching them and maintaining the interest and stuff like that.
Yeah, I've heard that the champions are all exclusive, and then there's a handful of non-champions who have also signed exclusivity agreements as well, and yeah, Fion being one of them.
I understand it if they're going to invest in their image.
Absolutely, yeah, it makes sense to have a kind of a hardcore group of guys who are your guys and make sure that they are competing regularly on your event and they're, as you said, not risking their reputation and their careers by losing in other organizations. But yeah, I don't think that people should be as worried about the exclusive contracts maybe as there's been a lot of chatter about how negative an exclusive contract can be. It makes sense for some, and it doesn't make sense for others, but everybody's in very different positions. It could hoover up some talent. I feel like the exclusive contracts could consolidate some of really big names into the UFC BJJ sphere, and this definitely could make it tricky for other grappling promotions to utilize that talent. But I don't think that there's only a limited number of professional grapplers then to draw upon, right? Because if you look at the sheer... No, I don't. If you look at the sheer number of competitors out there, whether you're a Polaris or Who's Number One or any other event, it's not hard to find guys who can compete on your event, even if there are a number who have an exclusive agreement with UFC, right? And there's always new guys coming through.
Always. There's a queue of people trying to get on these shows. There's only a handful of people that you can really count on to sell a show, create interest in a show, and then deliver when they come to compete. So those people going exclusive maybe creates a little issue. Like Fion being on the show is amazing. So that's definitely a benefit for UFC BJJ. But yeah, it's just the promotion game, I suppose. It's a mixture of building talent and like identifying up and comers, which is what I think Polaris is really good at, and then also nurturing, I guess, sort of champions. But you can either home grow a champion, or you can pay to bring one in who's like a pre-existing name. So it's always been a balance between those things.
One thing that I'm interested to follow as well with UFC BJJ is whether they utilize MMA fighters on their show, because we did see a number of sort of guys come over from MMA. I guess that they were between fights and they didn't have anything lined up, and we saw a couple of really good names compete on Fight Pass Invitational in the past. Not quite to the level of MMA fighters that Polaris has had in the past, former champions and such. But until now, at least, we've only seen pure Jiu-Jitsu guys competing on this UFC BJJ. And I'm wondering whether the UFC BJJ will start bringing across guys to compete for them. Because there are some great grapplers in the UFC who I'm sure would love the opportunity to make a couple thousand in a grappling match, because for them, a grappling match is just like training,
They always say that when they come over.
Yeah, there's no danger or threat, The worst thing that they can do is they can get, maybe an arm stretched or a kind of a knee cranked on a little bit, but there's much less risk of a catastrophic injury that could take them out of fighting MMA for any period of time. So,
unless they get horrifically heel hooked, which does happen.
It can, yeah, certainly can. But I imagine those guys would be smart enough to know that, if they try to gut out a heel hook, then they're going to be leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars, that they would otherwise win for an MMA fight. They'll be tapping quick, right?
Yeah, you'd hope so. Actually, I never thought about what you just said because we've always, because we were on Fight Pass, we've always tried in a way to cater to Fight Pass audience when we could. And now that I think about it, if that was their play, they would have done that from the beginning. They would have taken like some big MMA name, stuck him at the top of the show, and tried to bring in as many MMA fans as possible. And the fact that they haven't done that yet, I'm concluding means that they are going pure jiu-jitsu. That's it. I don't think, probably, I know that they've been talking closely to Dana and all the guys, and like the people that are in charge over there. And I'd imagine he probably told them not to muddy the waters, because they've blocked fighters appearing on Polaris before purely from like safety concerns, basically, or image concerns.
Right.
That if there's somebody has a big match coming up and then he flies over to fucking Doncaster and gets his knee broken, it doesn't look good for the $1 million match that he'd be doing a few months later. So
yeah,
I actually think now that I do think about it, it's probably not their plan to do that. And I know that they're still very close with, is it Fury fighting?
Yes. So the UFC,
and they seem to do those matches.
Yeah, they don't have too many grappling events on the Fight Pass platform anymore. They've got the EBI, they've got Polaris, they've got Fury, and Fury is an MMA show that also has grappling events here and there as well. That definitely seems to be where they've been putting the UFC fighters to kind of stay active in grappling matches, right? But if you look at their next card, the UFC BJJ 3, it is jiu-jitsu first. And there were some complaints actually from a few people about the sort of who are these guys? The sort of the casuals, they didn't necessarily know who a lot of these competitors are. But for people who follow jiu-jitsu, I mean, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's about 7 or 8 legit jiu-jitsu world champions on that card. Guys who have won major titles in gi and no gi, things like IBJJF and so on. So there's no lack of talent on this upcoming event, but outside of the jiu-jitsu scene, they're probably not so recognizable for now. Maybe this is an opportunity for them to kind of further establish their presence in the UFC BJJ.
I mean, the top part of the card is it's 50% Brazilian.
There's a lot of Brazilians. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it's I mean, the BJJ, as you mentioned, it's grappling. So, but it is curious to me that they've decided to use as many sort of Brazilian talents as they have.
One of the best shows that we ever did was Brazil versus the US squads, and that really opened our eyes to how. I mean, you know, because you used to live there, but just how big the sport is in Brazil. It is
huge,
massive. Our social media went bonkers. We had millions of views on we had like a clip of Hokage charging up before a match, and that went to 1 million views in 24 hours or something. And we did a deal with is it Combach, the TV station?
Yep.
And we never really benefited massively from that deal because, if I remember, I think Fight Pass came in and kind of took control of it. But there was definitely strong interest in this professional side of the sport from within Brazil. So it's probably a pretty calculated move on their part. It also helps that I guess loads of those guys are based in the US, Brazilians based in the US. But
I mean, they are. I think almost all of them are.
Yeah, I consider myself a kind of a jiu-jitsu nerd, but I'm probably more into the European scene than I guess the American scene. But when I look at this card, I do know everybody there. Not quite everybody.
No, there's a few names that I'm not particularly familiar with. I got to say, they definitely brought in a couple of up and comers, shall we say? But the majority of them are pretty notable to me.
Yeah, I mean it's a solid card. It's kind of like what we were saying earlier. Like, I don't really know what the story is behind any of these matches. Yeah, I mean, I know that they pin a lot on Mikey, which it's kind of an interesting choice. But
Okay,
he seems
so let's
very
talk
popular.
about that. Yeah, he does, right? But I got to say that I was a little bit surprised that they did bring in Mikey from the very beginning as a coach, and they decided to pretty much make him the face of UFC BJJ from the beginning. Now,
Yeah,
of course, nothing against Mikey. Mikey's awesome. Mikey is the number one guy at his weight class, and his results in his career speak for themselves. But Mikey is quite a divisive personality because he is the stereotypical jiu-jitsu nerd, right? He is the nerd assassin, the very unassuming kind of guy who's actually an absolute savage on the mat and can rip your limbs from your body. But he doesn't necessarily have the greatest appeal to everybody because Mikey has his style, and some people vibe with that, some people don't. I think that maybe it was actually that controversy sometimes is a good selling point. You can bring
yeah,
in a guy who's quite divisive, and you can get the guys the haters who are talking shit in the comments. That just boosts your engagement, right? It's just
yeah,
more
yeah,
eyeballs on what you're doing. But it does, at the same time, then you risk alienating a number of people who are like, oh, I don't want to watch that. So it's not like they're manufacturing controversy, but they definitely
no,
chose a rather controversial figure in some ways to lead their expansion into BJJ, rather than bringing in one of the really big established American or Australian kind of stars who could come in and carry that with their personality, their sound bites, and so on. Were you surprised that they hung everything on Mikey from the beginning?
yeah. Honestly, I mean, I'm pretty sure they would have had conversations with those bigger names, other names like Craig, Gordon, people like that in the beginning, and I just assumed that they never were able to come to an agreement.
They weren't. You're right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah,
That's exactly what happened. I'm not saying Mikey wasn't top of the list. They went through various options, and they came close to securing certain people to be the coaches
yeah,
for that first season. There was talk at one point of Craig versus Gordon as rival coaches, and then Gordon decided not to do it for whatever reason, or they couldn't come to an agreement. They were talking about Craig versus Mikey potentially as rival coaches. I felt like they were obviously in a bit of a bind, let's say, and in having to bring in Harrison Gabriel, who was a guy who nobody knew of and who spoke almost zero English, and he was basically just the guy for Mikey to roll over and to take the belt. I feel like that was a misstep on their part. But apparently it was only confirmed very, very, very close to the time they started filming. So it definitely
yeah,
seems like he wasn't their first choice,
yeah. I think
or second,
overall,
third, fourth, or fifth.
yeah. I mean, I think that if I can imagine, like their vision in the beginning probably was Mikey plus a bunch of other people, and then it just ended up being Mikey. Um,
The other question about Mikey as well, and this is, again, no offense to Mikey, but I feel like they chose a difficult division to sort of to start with, because we know that there isn't the depth of talent at 135 pounds as there is at 170 or 185. When you're looking at that sort of light featherweight weight class, the number of people who can even stand next to Mikey at that level is a very, very short list indeed. And
yeah,
whereas you look at the welterweights and middleweights, I mean, there's dozens of guys that you could you could bring in.
yeah, and generally, if you're talking about kind of mass public appeal, then it's like welterweight and above, really, isn't it? Like
Yes.
there's a kind of a precedent for that in MMA. Not that the lightweights aren't amazing, but it just the public in general. You don't have loads of people tuning in to watch a very small person, fight another very small person.
The
In my
style of
opinion.
jiu-jitsu sometimes is not always the most spectator friendly, right?
Yeah, there's something to be said for that. I'm not a massive fan. I like the kind of technical ability and the skill. He's unbelievably skilled, but I don't think like guard play, lying on your back, waiting for somebody to try to pass and then entering the legs. It's just not the most exciting thing to watch at all.
Right.
I have to credit Owen Livesey for basically completely changing my mind about what was exciting about grappling, because the way that I almost think that him picking someone up and launching them on their head is more fun to watch than, leg spaghetti.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. And I think that they actually have found a couple of really good guys at the lightweight and welterweight class that came out of the reality show. And Carlos Enrique, he kind of came out of nowhere. Now, I was very familiar with him. I've been following him since the colored belts. But he really, made his name on the UFC BJJ show by submitting everybody through the entire tournament, and into the final. The guy is incredible, and this is a life-changing moment for him to become the first UFC lightweight champion. I think that having Andrew Tackett as the welterweight champion is one of the absolute best things that they could have done. He came through the show again, submitted everybody, and then great submission in the final as well.
Awesome.
And he's a huge personality. He's an incredibly talented and exciting grappler as well. But I feel like maybe Carlos Enrique and Andrew Tackett, they chose them as well to go into the show because they wanted to build them up and to create that emotional connection with the audience. And then, now that they made it into this position as the champion, well, people are more invested in them and they're more likely to follow their career. So I think that Mikey's social media following, his established position in the sport, and the fact that he has had a ton of viral matches in the past and sort of really talked about moments, it made sense to bring in somebody of his caliber as the sort of the coach and the first 135-pound champion. But I'm happy to see that that Andrew Tackett, for example, this kid is a star. He always has been. Since before he was considered world class. The guy is just an incredibly exciting and talented guy, and I feel like there is probably no better home for him than the UFC BJJ promotion. He could very potentially reign as champion in that organization for years to come. And I really hope that translates into financial success and a long-lasting, really well-established career for him. I think there is absolutely no better place for him.
He's one of the handful of people that we were talking about earlier where an exclusive contract really matters because he just has that kind of star power.
There was definitely some concern from certain people in the industry when UFC BJJ made this great announcement that they were going to come into Jiu-Jitsu. Anybody who had any kind of business involvement in Jiu-Jitsu took notice. Some excited by that, some a little cautious and a little anxious maybe about what that meant. Let's talk about the sort of the pros and cons of UFC BJJ coming into the grappling landscape in a big way. First of all, what are the sort of the positives that you see from UFC BJJ coming into the grappling scene like this?
I think it's definitely bringing more eyeballs to the sport because it's kind of redirecting a lot of MMA fans and media and things like that towards Jiu-Jitsu. It's definitely legitimizing media outlets talking about Jiu-Jitsu, influencers or people that their media outlet is Instagram, but those guys talking about Jiu-Jitsu, that is big. They had a lot of people watching the reality show on YouTube, so I think the kind of rising tide, what's the phrase? A rising tide lifts all boats, lifts all ships.
Lifts all ships, yeah.
Yeah. It's raising the interest in Jiu-Jitsu in general. I think it's good to have another promotion for people to go and kind of stretch their legs in and see if it fits them. Honestly, it's nothing new because this has been going on for years. Somebody will decide to be interested in Jiu-Jitsu, invest a shitload of money into it, and then see what happens. It's a very unique sport. And I think sometimes people are a little bit surprised when they pull the curtain back. But yeah, I mean, positives, there are a lot of positives. Yeah. What about you? What do you think?
Number one, the most obvious thing for me is that there are just more events to watch.
Yeah.
I love the fact that we have potentially we have a new event series, a different product to what we already have. a certain level of professionalism and production that you associate with the UFC. It's rather streamlined if you look at the actual product. They're hosting it for now in the Apex Arena. They're not going overboard with the spectacle, with the lights, the production. It's quite focused on the jiu-jitsu itself. They're not trying to sell out thousands of seats in an arena. But I just love the fact that we're going to have potentially monthly jiu-jitsu events to watch with really good grapplers.
Fan, I feel the same. I watch way more jiu-jitsu than I do MMA now. So I'm pumped if I can sit and watch UFC BJJ on a Sunday morning.
Absolutely, it's exactly the same for me. I think that a positive as well is that the UFC have got a lot of flack over the years. You look at things like the class action lawsuit. There are a lot of people who have felt sort of mistreated by the UFC and not fairly paid and so on. But if you consider what they have done in growing the sport, if you consider how many millionaires they've created, if you look at how many fighters have managed to leverage their careers into bigger and better things, the number is not, it's a fair number of people who have managed to come through that. I'm not saying that possibility exists for the grapplers necessarily, but I do think that having a professional platform like the UFC is one of the best things that these grapplers could potentially do, because you can go off and you can win innumerable, let's say, IBJJF World Championship gold medals. Will it change your life? That's a big question mark. For some guys, yes, they're able to convert that tournament success into really solid careers, and many aren't. There are many IBJJF black belt world champions who have just been forgotten. Their names exist in the annals of history, but that gold medal really has done nothing to change their lives. And a lot of it rests on them as well. It's their responsibility to convert that competition success into a career. Some are good, some aren't. But I feel like if you maybe have either hit a point in your career where another IBJJF gold medal doesn't really change your position in the sport, but signing with UFC BJJ and competing and making money and then reaching a whole new demographic of fans, I think that that's really powerful and a huge opportunity that these guys, I hope they recognize the opportunity that's in front of them.
Yeah. I feel like I know for a fact that the kind of A sides on the cards are getting well paid. I don't know. I think the kind of lower matches or the other athletes that have been invited, not everyone's getting a really amazing paycheck, and I do wonder. Let's say you win the second or third match on the card. I don't know if that's going to change your life, but I agree that it's a good thing to aim for. I remember one of Craig's kind of attacks on the UFC or whatever was that some of the numbers were inflated, and one of the ways that he kind of analyzed that was the lack of bump in social numbers for the guys that were on the show. Because, like Carlos Enrique, for example, as soon as I saw him grapple, I was like, yeah, I'm following this dude. And if I remember, he only had a few thousand followers, I think. I can't remember. That might have been someone else. And I followed him, and then by the end of the show, it hadn't really gone up that much just yet. So I feel like UFC BJJ, although it started incredibly strong and has that prestige by being associated with the UFC, it still does have a way to go before it's done. It's created a kind of ecosystem for people.
Yeah. Well, it's not automatic success guaranteed, right? It's on the athletes and it's on those guys to actually work for it as well. The UFC is not going to do everything for you. They can give you the opportunity, but ultimately it rests on the athlete's shoulders to convert that appearance on UFC into into the other stuff as well. But I think you're absolutely right about the pay as well. From what I've heard, the champions are well taken care of, probably getting paid similar amounts to what they would on any other major promotion out there. I remember that the UFC had a reputation for paying considerable amounts of money to the big names that when they were competing on Fight Pass Invitational. I know for a fact guys like Gordon, Nicky Rod, Craig Jones, they were getting paid six figures to compete in a single super fight. You know, that is a lot of money that they probably wouldn't get paid by most other jiu-jitsu promotions. There are very few jiu-jitsu promotions who have pockets that deep. I feel like part of this restructuring and the rebranding as UFC BJJ was to kind of rein that in. So
definitely.
From what I heard, the champions are probably getting a decent amount of money. They might be getting sort of like $10,000-$20,000, or let's say 10 and 10 or something like that to compete, 15 and 15 to compete in a title match, or maybe they have to work their way up to approximately that amount. But absolutely, if you're on sort of the prelims, or if you're on the mid card, you're maybe getting 1,500, maybe 2 and 2, maybe 3 and 3 as you work your way up the card. But one thing I do feel is, like, much like the UFC, that you are rewarded for your success. And these contracts probably stipulate that, the second, third, fourth match, as you work your way up through the ranks and as you do start getting closer to the sort of main event, that there's an opportunity to make more money from it, for sure. But ultimately, the economics as an event organizer makes sense that you pay those guys a sort of, let's say, almost like a token show fee, because you don't want to invest a lot of money into a guy who maybe isn't going to make the standard, right?
Yeah. I think
if they don't have what you want as a fighter, if they don't necessarily perform to the level that you were hoping for, if they don't bring the numbers, if you're not getting those highlight reel moments, well, it's maybe a case of like, well, thanks, you tried your best. We might call you again, might not.
Yeah, I mean, it ties back into what we were saying before about building a proper structure of working your way up to the belt. But in order for that to mean something, the belt needs to mean something with a little bit of history, and the money needs to mean something. So, if somebody's very confident in themselves and their ability to win, they'll take the $1,000 match first of all, but they've got their eye on the $10,000 match, the title match that they will work their way up to. It's something that we've been talking about for ages in Polaris as well, because a lot of the negotiations with people are just it's just pulled out of thin air half the time. And
where are you getting this number from? Why do you think you're worth this much money?
And the cold hard kind of reality is a lot of the guys, there really is only a handful of people that everyone in jiu-jitsu will stop everything and sit down and watch, like Craig, Fionn, Gordon, I guess Mikey, people like that. There's probably a couple more, like Gary Tonin used to be like that, because you knew you were getting something insane.
But it is a short list. It is a very, very short list.
Very short list. So then you enter into like negotiations with people, and they're just pulling money, pulling figures from thin air. We've sat next to them. We've sat next to fighters in the past where they're discussing other events or promotions, and they are literally just saying, just say this much, who cares? And then they just see what happens, So I do appreciate the idea of standardizing it a little bit and then waiting. It's almost like you're waiting the top of the card or waiting the belt to mean the most and be the most valuable, rather than the person or the, So it's almost like, well, this is the belt match, so it's worth this much. It's not, it's worth this much because it's this guy versus this guy,
Right.
I feel like that's a good idea, and we've spoken about it a lot. We want to do that next year, kind of refocus on jiu-jitsu people and also the UK and European community, and say that if you end up getting up to the belt, it's going to be this much money and this much recognition, and make that a really clear path.
Another positive that I potentially see from UFC BJJ, and I'm sure that this will happen at some point. We haven't seen any indication of it yet because it's so new. But I like the idea of an actual ranking system as well.
Yeah.
A top 10 and with the champion at the top, and
independent rankings. Yeah, I've been thinking about that for years. I had a few meetings with a guy about making an automated ranking system that would pull results from various places. But that's definitely necessary.
But it would have to be a UFC ranking, and as these divisions grow and as they bring in talents, and the results, they would actually feed into that ranking. I like the idea of an actual UFC ranking based on those divisions that they have, because you can't really create a universal ranking in grappling and jiu-jitsu, because the tournaments and the competitions are just, there's such a disparity between the level of competition, between the rules. The results don't necessarily matter as much, you know, when you're trying to sort of make that ranking. I'll give you an example. You know, if you were to take professional events like UFC, who's number one, Polaris, and you were to try and stack those results against what they meant from somebody who is like an ADCC champion or an IBJJF no-gi world champion, and or is also, you know, active in other super fight events, it's very difficult to consolidate all of that into one universal ranking. For number one, the weight classes are all over the place. And, you know, you can have a guy who is competing at one weight in ADCC, another one in IBJJF, and then super fights, he can be bouncing around all over the place. I feel like, you know, the very structured, the unified MMA style weight classes that they're using, 135, 145, 155, 170, 185, so on and so on. That is just so easy then, because you have these very clearly delineated buckets of athletes, these divisions, and you're able to say, okay, well, this is your division, this is how many matches you've had, this is who you beat, this is where you sit in the rankings. Trying to take a guy who's won a tournament and has become the world champion, but you look at the results of who he actually beat, and maybe half of those matches on the path to gold were quite insignificant. And then let's say he goes off and he loses, in effect, what is an exhibition match and maybe a submission only event somewhere else. How do you calculate that? It's so difficult to do. Yeah, it's so difficult to do a universal ranking. And I know, because I had to do it in the past, and it was just the worst freaking job you can imagine. It was just a massive headache. I think that the UFC ranking, or the potential for a UFC ranking, is really exciting, and I do like that. But that's going to take some time to shake out, because you're going to need to do the groundwork of having these events, building out these divisions to be able to actually to come up with what those rankings look like. You need at least 10
people in each division to start with, don't you?
Exactly that. Yeah. We talked about some upsides to the UFC's entry into jiu-jitsu. Do you see any immediate concerns that, like, oh, this is potentially negative, this is something that we should be worried about?
From what perspective?
Any perspective, you know, as a promoter, as a fan, absolutely somebody from inside the industry, somebody who just follows jiu-jitsu. Is there anything that you look at with UFC BJJ and you're like, not sure about what that means for the greater grappling community?
I mean, I feel like the people behind it genuinely love jiu-jitsu. In fact, I know so, because we've met with them many times, and they're pretty supportive of other shows, as long as you don't go on social media and start trashing them like Craig did. I mean, yeah, like I'm a little bit sad that we won't be able to use Fion for the foreseeable future. So I guess like you could call that a negative, where we've lost one of the stars of the show.
Somebody you've invested a lot into.
Yeah, exactly. So that, I mean, potential negatives, is losing access to some high-level athletes. But I still feel like there's a long way to go before it becomes a real problem, because the only way that it will become a problem is if they exclusively sign every single exciting athlete, and those athletes remain there and are happy. You know, like One Championship tried to do it with many good grapplers, and I think behind closed doors most of them are unhappy with that situation, which means as soon as they get a chance to leave, they do. I mean, going back to Mikey, I believe the UFC made a huge point about poaching him from One, and that, you know, even before UFC BJJ was a thing, they were kind of serenading him a little bit, almost like they'd freed him from his East Asian prison. So, like, yeah, from a promoter perspective, it's just competition. But like I was saying earlier, it's nothing that we haven't seen before. You know, a large, powerful organization or individual deciding that jiu-jitsu is the next big thing and putting loads of time and effort into it has been happening for the last 10 years. So, you know, we're constantly reevaluating what we're doing and how we're doing it anyway. So It's just another chance to do that. You know, looking at the things that they're doing and seeing which things are good, which things are bad. The good things maybe we start to think about more, incorporate, like you said, standardized weight classes, you know, clear routes to championship belts. That's a really good thing that they're doing. And standardized payments too. Those are all things that, you know, they've kind of highlighted as being important that we will take on board.
I don't see as many downsides to the UFC coming into Jiu-Jitsu as maybe some people do. And of course, number one, I'm not an event promoter, so I don't have to worry about the competition like other people do. I'm not seeing them as competition like others did, right? Like you put very well, you explained it extremely well, you know, that anybody who's running an event, now you suddenly have somebody with deep pockets who can come in and they can hoover up the talent and they can make your life a little bit difficult. Personally, I understand that, of course, but I don't see it as a terrible thing, because if you look at the MMA landscape, there are many high-level MMA events that function extremely well with non-UFC talent, and they can make money, they can survive, and whether they act as an unofficial or official feeder league for the UFC or not, and they're completely independent. It hasn't stopped other events from operating, and I don't think that, you know, anything will be different in grappling. Initial concern that I had was definitely whether it would push other players out of the market. And I think that was one of my concerns. It was, well, if the UFC are coming in and if they are taking all this talent, how will that affect maybe the sort of the small to medium sized players? Are these guys, are they going to benefit, like you say, rising tide lifting all ships, or are they going to suddenly, get hit and they're going to have less access to decent talent, and that their products will suffer as a result because they just can't compete with paying these athletes what they want, or even just the level of athletes to, you know, make a professional product. That was an initial concern of mine, but I will be completely honest, I don't see as many downsides to UFC BJJ coming into the space as maybe some did. I definitely think that if anybody's seeing UFC as competition and trying to go head to head with them, that's a really dangerous move. And yes, I would caution anybody from trying to do that, because the UFC are very good at just focusing on their thing and letting other people get on with theirs. But the moment that you start messing with them, that can become a problem, and you definitely don't want to go head to head with them. You know, they are extremely protective of their brand, of their product, and they will go to great lengths to make your life difficult if you start messing with their, well, basically if you start messing with their money, because that's what it all comes down to, right? So
for sure.
Yeah, I'm not as concerned about UFC BJJ coming into it. I see far more upsides to UFC BJJ coming into the sort of the grappling industry as opposed to negatives. And I'm, like I said, just going back to it, I'm genuinely excited that we've got more to watch. For me, that's not a bad thing, right?
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Unknown Precious. I think it was kind of cool to get into the UFC. I'm sure we'll have a lot more to discuss as things to develop, because there's definitely going to be a lot coming in 2026. But it was a fun conversation, and pretty much all that's left is just to ask everybody to like and subscribe and to follow us, whether it is on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching this on YouTube, please leave a like. That's really important for us to win the algorithm. But that's it. If you have any comments, please make sure to leave them below, and we'll see you again next week.